The bank was silent, except for the soft tapping of high heels against the polished marble floor. Veronica Davis, a well-dressed black woman in her 40s, approached the counter holding a large check in her hand. Across from her, Richard Calloway, the white bank manager, barely glanced up. But when he saw the amount on the check, his eyebrows shot up in disbelief. $500,000! His lips curled into a smirk. He pushed the check back across the counter. "We don't cash fake checks here." A few customers looked up, sensing tension. A security guard shifted uncomfortably. Veronica remained calm, but her eyes darkened. This wasn't the first time someone had judged her based on her skin color. But today, Richard was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. What happens next will leave everyone in this bank speechless. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more powerful stories. The check remained untouched on the counter, pushed back toward Veronica as if its very presence was an offense. The air inside the bank was thick with tension, but Richard Calloway, the middle-aged white bank manager, didn't seem to notice or care. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, barely concealing the smug expression on his face. "Miss, I don't know where you got this, but we don't process fraudulent checks." Veronica Davis held his gaze, her posture poised and composed. There was no anger on her face, just a quiet certainty. She knew this bank better than anyone in the building. After all, she owned it. But today, she'd come in as a customer, not as the CEO. Today, she wanted to see firsthand how people were treated when they didn't walk in wearing privilege like a name tag. And, as she had suspected, the reality was exactly as she feared. The bank was a marble-clad fortress of wealth, its towering glass walls reflecting the bright afternoon sun. Expensive chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting soft golden light on the neatly arranged counters and teller stations. It was a place designed to intimidate, to remind customers that money ruled here, and that not everyone was welcome. The clients were mostly affluent white professionals, dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses. They moved through the bank with ease, chatting with tellers, making transactions without a second thought. But when Veronica had walked in, there was a shift. The subtle glances from employees, the way the security guard's eyes followed her too closely, the tight smile of the receptionist. It all pointed to one thing. She was being judged before she even spoke. Veronica wasn't just wealthy, she was powerful. CEO, investor, philanthropist. Her name commanded respect in corporate circles. But that didn't matter here. Standing at the counter, dressed in a navy blue business suit, her natural curls neatly styled, and her heels clicking sharply against the floor, she knew exactly what Richard saw. A black woman holding a check that, in his mind, she had no business having. But Veronica had spent her entire life proving people like him wrong. She had built her empire from nothing, fighting through every roadblock society had thrown at her. She had faced doubt, discrimination, and systemic bias, but she had never let it define her. And today, she was about to remind everyone in this bank exactly who she was. Richard Calloway had worked in banking for over 2 decades. He prided himself on knowing his clients, or at least believing he did. To him, wealth had a certain look, a certain pedigree, a certain color. So when Veronica had stepped up to his counter with a $500,000 check, his instinct wasn't to verify it. It was to reject it, because in his mind, a black woman with that kind of money had to be up to something. He wasn't outright aggressive. He didn't need to be. His condescension did all the work. "We have strict policies against fraud, miss." He paused, pretending to look at the name on the check, even though he had already read it. Davis, Veronica supplied smoothly. "And this check is valid." Richard chuckled under his breath. "I'm sure you'd like me to believe that." A few customers had begun to slow their steps, sensing the shift in tone. A young bank teller, watching from the side, shifted nervously. She seemed to recognize the name on the check, but she didn't dare speak up. Not yet. Veronica took a deep breath, glancing around the bank. She had built this institution to be a place of financial empowerment, a place where people from all backgrounds could feel safe and respected. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal in her own bank. Her eyes flickered to the security guard near the entrance. He was watching her closely now, his hand resting near his radio. They were ready to remove her, and that's when Veronica knew. This wasn't just about her. It was about every single person who had walked through these doors and been treated unfairly. She wouldn't let this go. Not today. Not ever. And Richard Calloway was about to learn that the hard way. The air in the bank grew heavier, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Veronica remained still, the check still resting on the counter between her and Richard Calloway. She had seen this scenario play out before. Not here, not in this bank, but in countless other places, across different points in her life. Being doubted, being dismissed, being denied. But what Richard didn't know was that today he had picked the wrong woman. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter like he was addressing a child. His smile was condescending, a subtle smirk curling his lips. "Miss Davis, let's be reasonable. Check's this large need verification. It's for your own protection." Veronica raised an eyebrow. "Then verify it." Richard let out a low chuckle and shook his head. "You misunderstand me. We can't verify it because we already know it's not real." A few customers had begun to take notice now. Some whispered, while others simply watched in uncomfortable silence. A well-dressed white man behind Veronica handed in his check, a sizable amount. The teller smiled, verified it instantly, and handed him his receipt. Veronica didn't miss it. Neither did the other black customers in the room. She clasped her hands together, her patience wearing thin. "Mr. Calloway, I don't need your assumptions. I need you to do your job." Richard's smile disappeared. He had expected her to argue, maybe even beg, but this woman was too calm, too composed. It irritated him. "I am doing my job, Miss Davis," he snapped, straightening his suit. "And my job is to protect this institution from fraud." Veronica tilted her head slightly. "So, you assume fraud because of the size of the check?" Richard sighed, exasperated. "It's not just the size. It's about who's holding it." The words slipped out before he could stop them. A heavy silence fell over the room. A few tellers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. A black woman near the waiting area let out a quiet scoff. A security guard cleared his throat, suddenly aware that this was no longer a simple transaction. Veronica, however, remained completely still. Her face didn't betray a hint of emotion, but inside, she felt the familiar sting of discrimination, not just for herself, but for every black person who had been told, in one way or another, "You don't belong here." She took a deep breath and pushed the check back toward him. "Process it." Richard hesitated. This was supposed to be easy. He had done this before. Rejected checks, denied services, sent people away without a second thought. But now, people were watching. One of the junior tellers, a young Latina woman, bit her lip. She could see the name Veronica Davis printed in bold letters on the check. It sounded familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. She turned to her supervisor, whispering, "Shouldn't we at least check the account?" The supervisor shook his head quickly. "Stay out of it." Richard sighed, done with the conversation. "That's enough," he said, waving over the security guard. "Escort her out." The security guard hesitated. He had been watching everything unfold. He wasn't sure how this would end, but something felt off. Still, he stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Veronica slowly turned her head toward the guard, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked softly. There was something in her tone, something that sent a flicker of doubt through the man's mind. Richard, however, was impatient. "She doesn't belong here," he muttered under his breath. "She's wasting everyone's time." Another mistake. Veronica leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the counter. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice cool, controlled. "I'm giving you one last opportunity to process my check." Richard rolled his eyes. "And I'm giving you one last opportunity to leave before I have you removed." The tension hit its breaking point. A young intern, new to the bank, rushed forward holding a tablet. He looked panicked, almost afraid. "Sir," he whispered, his face pale, "I think you should check this." Richard turned, annoyed. "Not now, Parker." The intern hesitated. Then, with a shaky breath, he stepped closer and turned the screen toward Richard. What Richard saw made the blood drain from his face. His hands tightened around the edge of the counter. His breathing became shallow. Displayed on the screen was the bank's official ownership records, and next to the words "Bank CEO and Majority Shareholder" was a name he had just dismissed. Veronica Davis. His throat went dry. Veronica watched him closely, waiting. And then, in a voice just above a whisper, she said the words that would change everything. "You just tried to throw your boss out of her own bank." The color drained from Richard Calloway's face. His hands, once steady and confident, trembled as he stared at the tablet screen. The name next to Bank CEO and Majority Shareholder was clear, undeniable. Veronica Davis, the same woman he had just humiliated. The same woman he had dismissed without a second thought. The same woman who now stood across from him, watching him with quiet intensity. For the first time since their conversation started, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear. Veronica didn't move. She let the moment sink in, let him feel the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. Then, slowly, she picked up the check, the very one he had refused to process, and held it between two fingers. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. "Do you understand what just happened here?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it stuck. The entire bank had gone silent. Tellers, customers, and security guards stood frozen in place. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all waiting. Richard's mind raced. He had spent years in this bank, making decisions without question. He had seen countless customers, turned some away without a second thought. But never, not once, had he thought that one of them might actually own the very institution he worked for. His legs felt weak. His stomach churned. If she wanted, she could fire him on the spot. Worse than that, she could ruin his career. This wasn't just a mistake. It was the mistake. He forced a weak chuckle, trying to regain his composure. "Miss Davis, I had no idea. If I had known, I would have—" Veronica's eyes narrowed slightly. "If you had known," she echoed, tilting her head. "What exactly would you have done differently, Mr. Calloway?" Richard felt the room closing in on him. Think. He swallowed hard. I wouldn't have—" His words trailed off, because the truth was he knew exactly what he had done. And so did everyone else. The bank employees began whispering among themselves. A few tellers exchanged glances. Some looked ashamed, realizing they had stayed silent while discrimination happened right in front of them. A young black woman, standing in line, shook her head. "So, because you thought she was just another black woman, you treated her like a criminal?" Another customer, an older black man, crossed his arms. "This is what we deal with every day," he muttered. The weight of their words hit Richard like a punch. Veronica nodded slightly, acknowledging the murmurs. "Mr. Calloway, let's make something clear," she said, stepping forward. "You weren't enforcing policy. You weren't protecting this institution. You were acting on bias. Your bias." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but what could he say? The evidence was all around him. Veronica exhaled slowly, then turned to the tellers. "Who approved his promotion?" The room stilled. A middle-aged man, one of the senior banking officers, stepped forward hesitantly. "I did," he admitted. Veronica glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Did you ever question how he treated customers?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. I assumed he was just doing his job." Veronica nodded again, as if she had expected that answer. "And that's the problem." She turned back to Richard. "You didn't act alone. This bank allowed you to operate this way." The weight of her words settled over the room. Richard's breath quickened. He could feel his career slipping through his fingers. "Miss Davis, please," he stammered. "I've worked here for 20 years. I didn't mean any harm. If I could just get a second chance." Veronica lifted a single hand, silencing him. "A second chance," she repeated. "Tell me, Mr. Calloway, how many second chances did you give the people you turned away?" Richard's face burned. Veronica waited, but he had no answer, because the truth was he had never given second chances. Veronica took a deep breath and turned toward the crowd. "This stops today." The room held its breath. "Starting now, this bank will operate differently. We will implement strict anti-discrimination policies. Every employee, no matter their position, will undergo mandatory training. And if they refuse to uphold the values of fairness and integrity," she turned back to Richard, "then they won't work here anymore." A security guard stepped forward. Richard's face turned ghostly pale. "Miss Davis, please." "You're fired, Mr. Calloway." A hush fell over the bank. It was over. As Richard was escorted out, the bank seemed different. Customers whispered. Employees stood a little taller. For years, they had accepted the way things were. But today, they had seen what change looked like. Veronica watched Richard disappear through the glass doors, then turned to the tellers. "From now on, we do better. Understood?" They nodded quickly, some relieved, some inspired. A young intern, the same one who had shown Richard the tablet, stepped forward nervously. "Ms. Davis," he said, clearing his throat, "I just wanted to say thank you." She offered a small smile. "Don't thank me. Just remember this moment, and never be afraid to speak up." With that, Veronica turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished marble. She had come in as a customer. She had left as a leader. And from this day forward, her bank would stand for fairness, for justice, for everyone. The glass doors swung shut behind Richard Calloway as he stumbled onto the sidewalk. The sun was blinding, but not as blinding as the reality of what had just happened. His career, his reputation, his authority, gone in an instant. For years, he had walked into that bank with confidence, with power, with control. Now he stood outside it like a lost man, stripped of everything. The security guard who had escorted him out didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked back inside, leaving Richard standing alone, his world collapsing around him. Richard's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. There had to be a way out of this. His fingers hovered over his contacts. Should he call someone? A lawyer, a friend, his supervisor? But then it hit him. He had no one. For years, Richard had built his career on control, not relationships. He hadn't been respected. He had been feared. Now that the fear was gone, so was his power. He looked back through the glass doors, into the bank he had ruled over for decades. Inside, the employees whispered among themselves, exchanging nervous glances. They had seen what happened. They had seen a man fall from power. And worse, they weren't sorry. Back inside, a group of bank employees stood together, still reeling from what had just unfolded. A young black woman, a teller who had often been ignored or spoken down to by Richard, exhaled deeply. "Can't believe he's gone." The older male supervisor, the one who had approved Richard's promotion, ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I should have done something sooner." The Latina intern, the one who had first pointed out to Veronica's name, bit her lip. "We all should have." There was a heavy realization settling over them. They had let this happen. For years, they had watched Richard discriminate, dismiss, and degrade people. And they had said nothing. Why? Because they had been afraid. But today, that fear had been replaced with something else: accountability. Across the bank, customers who had witnessed everything were still talking about it. An older black man spent his life dealing with men like Richard shook his head. "I've seen this kind of thing too many times." A young white woman, who had simply been waiting in line before the whole situation unfolded, sighed. "I never realized how deep this goes." A middle-aged man, arms crossed, nodded toward the door where Richard had been escorted out. "And now he knows what it feels like to be denied without a fair chance." Richard remained outside the bank, watching as the reality of the situation fully hit him. For the first time in his life, he was the one on the outside looking in. He had spent years deciding who belonged and who didn't. Now, he was the one being shut out. He turned from the glass doors and began to walk, his steps slower, heavier. For years, he had seen himself as untouchable. Today, he had learned that no one is above consequences. But most painfully, he had learned that respect is not something you take. It's something you earn. And he had spent his entire career earning nothing. From her office, Veronica watched everything unfold. She saw Richard standing outside, lost. She saw the employees talking, processing what had happened. She saw the shift. She had no joy in humiliating him. That was never the goal. But she knew what needed to be done. Because this wasn't just about one man. It was about an entire system. One that had failed people like her for far too long. Veronica turned from the window and exhaled. Her work wasn't finished. The real fight, it was just beginning. Richard Calloway walked slowly down the sidewalk, his hands buried in his pockets. His mind raced. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to go. No job, no authority, no one who feared him enough to listen to his excuses. He glanced back at the bank, his former kingdom. From the outside, it looked the same as it always had. But inside, everything had changed. Meanwhile, inside the bank, there was a different energy in the air. It wasn't just that Richard was gone. It was that, for the first time, people felt seen. The tellers and junior employees who had once avoided making eye contact with customers like Veronica now saw the importance of their role. The Latina intern, the first to realize who Veronica was, turned to the other tellers. "Do you think things will really change?" A senior teller, a middle-aged black woman, gave her a small smile. "They already have." At that moment, Veronica stepped back into the bank, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. All conversation stopped. She looked around at her employees, her people. Veronica exhaled slowly before speaking. "I built this bank to create opportunities, not barriers." She paused, making sure everyone was listening. What happened today should never happen again. Not here, not anywhere. A few nods, a few guilty glances. Veronica continued. "Every single customer who walks through those doors deserves the same level of respect. No assumptions, no bias, just fairness." She placed her hands on the counter, meeting the gaze of every employee. If anyone has a problem with that, you know where the door is. A few employees shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved. Instead, the Latina intern raised her hand slightly. "Miss Davis, what will happen to Richard?" Veronica sighed, crossing her arms. Richard made his choices, and today, those choices caught up with him. Meanwhile, Richard sat on a park bench, staring down at his phone. He had spent the last hour calling old colleagues, hoping someone would help him. No one had picked up. He wasn't sure if it was because they had already heard what happened, or if they had simply never cared about him in the first place. He thought about all the people he had turned away, all the customers he had disrespected, and for the first time, he wondered what would have happened if he had treated them differently. If he had treated Veronica differently, would he still have his job? Would he still have his power? Back at the bank, things were already changing. Customers who had witnessed the confrontation began talking about it online. By the end of the day, a video of the incident had gone viral. Bank manager learns the hard way who really owns the business. The comments flooded in. He got what he deserved. How many other businesses do this every day? Respect is a two-way street. Later that evening, Veronica sat in her office, reviewing a proposal. The document was simple. New anti-discrimination policies, mandatory diversity training, strict accountability for employees who judged customers unfairly, a whistleblower protection program for employees who reported discrimination. She smiled, signing her name at the bottom. This wasn't about one moment. It wasn't about one man. It was about fixing a system that had failed too many people for too long. As she leaned back in her chair, her assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Davis, someone's here to see you." Veronica raised an eyebrow. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "Richard Calloway." Veronica's expression didn't change. "Send him in." The door to Veronica's office opened slowly, and Richard Calloway stepped inside. He looked nothing like the arrogant man from earlier. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes downcast. The confidence that once defined him was gone. Veronica watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. "Have a seat, Richard," she said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. He hesitated before sitting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he cleared his throat. "Ms. Davis, I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Veronica didn't react. "Are you sorry for what you did?" she asked. "Or sorry you got caught?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but he wasn't sure of the answer, and Veronica could see it. She leaned forward, folding her hands. "Respect isn't about who holds the most power, Richard. It's about how you treat people, even when you think they have nothing to offer you." Richard looked down, nodding slowly. Veronica exhaled, then reached for a folder on her desk. "This is a second chance program we're launching for employees who need to unlearn old habits and rebuild trust." She slid the folder toward him. Richard blinked in shock. You're giving me a second chance." Veronica smiled just slightly. "That depends. Are you ready to change? This wasn't just Richard's story. It was the story of every person who has been judged unfairly, of every person who never got a second chance. Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance? Or should actions always have consequences? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in fairness, justice, and respect for all, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Because real change starts with us. Thank you for watching. See you in the next powerful story.